Hello, everybody, and happy Saturday. I hope you are all having a wonderful Saturday so far. Let me know down in the comments what you are up to today. Welcome back if you've been here before. If you're new here, then welcome. I am Jen, and my channel is the Literary Love 123 BookTube channel. And this is the Literary Love Book Club live show for Crypt of the Moon Spider by Nathan Ballingrud. I did not invite a co-host today. Normally my book club live shows will have co-hosts, but September and August were really chaotic months for me. And then Crypt of the Moon Spider is so short, I thought I'll just wing this one today. So I'm hoping for a lot of input from everybody in the comment section. So let me see who's here. Hello, Stina. How are you today? I love that. Stina, the arachnophobe, has entered the chat. Did you make it okay through this book? I used to have a lot of struggles with arachnophobia, but I've learned to conquer that over the years a bit, where I don't totally freak out at the sight of a spider. I've really learned to appreciate them. But that's not to say if one, suddenly like appeared on my shoulder that I wouldn't freak out. Hello, Stuart. How are you today? Lovely to see you also. So we'll go ahead now and just kind of talk. And I am looking forward to hearing what you thought about this book. So we'll start with the non-spoiler section first. I want to give a little bit of an author bio for Nathan Ballingrud. And I got this information from his website at nathanballingrud.com. He has a blog titled Blog in a Jar. So let me tell you a little bit about Nathan Ballingrud, the author of Crypt and the Moon Spider. He was born in Massachusetts in 1970, but he spent most of his life in the South. He studied literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and at the University of New Orleans. Among other things, he has been a cook on oil rigs and barges, a waiter, and a bartender in New Orleans. So not that far from me when he was bartending in New Orleans. His most recent book, Crypt of the Moon Spider, that we'll be talking about today, is actually the first in a trilogy titled the Lunar Gothic Trilogy. He's also the author of The Strange, Wounds, 6 Stories from the Border of Hell from Saga Press, North American Lake Monsters from Small Beer Press, and he's won 2 Shirley Jackson Awards, and he's been shortlisted for the World Fantasy, British Fantasy, and Bram Stoker Awards. His stories also appear in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2023, and his stories Body Shocks, Extreme Tales of Body Horror, Echoes, the Saga Anthology of Ghost Stories, and several other anthologies. His novella, The Visible Filth, was made into a movie called Wounds that was released from Annapurna Pictures. It was written and directed by Babak Anvari and stars Armie Hammer, Zazie Beetz, and Dakota Johnson. So I haven't read any of his other books, and I had no idea that he had works that had been adapted into film. He also has his book, North American Lake Monsters, that was adapted into a Hulu series called Monsterland. And it's written by Mary Laws with Babak Anvari and Luca Ton as executive producers. And Nathan currently resides in Asheville, North Carolina. So I would love to know if any of you have actually read any other books by Nathan Ballingrud, or if you've seen the movie Wounds or the Hulu series Monsterland. Let us know if you have and what you thought about them, because I would like to check them out. So next, we'll just kind of go over a synopsis of the book. And I'll be honest, I'm going to give you the Goodreads synopsis because I really struggled with how to summarize this book. So if you read it, I think you can kind of see what I mean. It's kind of hard to summarize it. Years ago, in a cave beneath the dense forests and streams on the surface of the moon, a gargantuan spider once lived. Its silk granted its first worshippers immense faculties of power and awe. The book is set in 1923 and it focuses on Verona Brinkley as she's touching down on the moon for her intake at the Barrowfield Home for the Treatment of the Melancholy. A renowned facility, Dr. Barrington Cole's invasive and highly successful treatments have been lauded by many. And they're so simple. All it takes is a little spider silk in the amygdala, maybe a strand or two in the prefrontal cortex, and perhaps an inch in the hippocampus for near evisceration of those troublesome thoughts and ideas. But trouble lurks in many a mind at this facility. And although the spider's been dead for years, its denizens are not. Someone or something is up to no good, and Veronica just might be the cause. So now I'm going to go ahead and check the comments before we go on with the next part of our show. Okay, so Stina says she really enjoyed the book. Normally doesn't do spiders or body horror, but this was great. Yay! I'm glad you conquered your fear and enjoyed the book. Hello again, Eleanor. I saw Eleanor a little while earlier today on Cat's Saturday Morning Momentum. It's also Stina's first experience with Nathan Ballingrud. And Stuart says he hasn't read any books or seen anything from him. And Eleanor is also new to this author. So it looks like this is the first experience for all of us. And it seems like, from what I'm hearing, it was a pretty good experience. So let's go right into that then, and let's talk about our ratings next. So I gave this book 4 stars, but I'm wondering if after we chat about it today, if my rating could go up to 5 stars. Sometimes that happens where I'll rate something, a little bit lower, and then I talk about it with other people, and I'm like, you know what? I think I'm going to bump it on up. So it was 4 stars for me. So let's see what we have in our comments. I'm a little slow sometimes on getting to the right spot with the comments. Hey, Adrian, how are you? I'm so glad that you are here today. Adrian loved it, thought it was incredible. It did have so much beautiful imagery, and it was very original in the way that it took different elements and put them together to formulate this really unique type of story. Okay, so Adrian has read North American Lake Monsters. What did you think about that, Adrian? I would like to read more from Nathan Ballingrud, so I'd love to know what you thought of that. 4 stars. 4 stars. Good reports. Let's see. Stuart hasn't rated it at least 4.5. Strange book, but I loved it. Yes, I'm excited because it is book 1 in the Lunar Gothic trilogy. So at the end of our discussion, we'll give a little bit of a preview of what book 2 in the Lunar Gothic trilogy is about. So I'm definitely interested in continuing with Nathan Ballingrud. So now I want to go ahead before we do anything else, actually, and I want to talk about content and trigger warnings, which I gave those prior to, talking about this being our book club pick for August. There is going to be commentary on depression, on mental illness of other types, mistreatment of the mentally ill, suicidal ideation, suicide. I'm going to actually go into some history surrounding the treatment of the mentally ill, especially as it concerns women. And so just content warnings for all of that. So I'm going to wait just a minute and get a sip to give everybody a chance. If you would like to step away for a while and then come back. Once we are past the literary and historical context, we'll go right into spoilers and talk about the book. But I just want you to know while this is up, we are going to be doing some discussion of some real life basis for this novella. Also, go ahead real quick and check this comment before we talk about that. Let's see. 4 stars. So 4.5 seems to be our consensus at this starting point anyway with who is here today. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is an article titled From Hysteria to Empowerment. This is written by Isabella Blackman for medicine.yale.edu. So let's talk about the origins of the word hysteria. So in ancient Greece, physicians that practiced in the Hippocratic tradition commonly diagnosed women who were suffering with symptoms such as pain, heavy menstrual bleeding, depression, anxiety, fatigue, infertility with hysteria. This term comes from the Greek word hystera, which is the Greek word for uterus. So the physicians posited that these women patients developed hysteria because they were not fulfilling their womanly duty to marry and bear children. Therefore, that caused their uterus to become displaced and wander around the body. The cure the doctors advised in some cases was just for these women to quickly get married and have children. Throughout history, medical treatments for these so-called female problems ranged from hanging women upside down and shaking them to return the uterus to its rightful place, to horrific procedures, even worse, such as putting leeches in the vagina and giving suppositories of bull urine. Women were accused of madness, witchcraft, or demonic possession and forced to undergo exorcisms, burned as witches, or confined in mental institutions. And unfortunately, stories of misdiagnosis and mistreatment are not just curiosities of ancient and medieval history. In the Victorian era, similar things happened to women. We're going to be talking a little bit as we go through Crypt of the Moon Spider. I'll be referencing The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in which she talks about the rest cure, which was an actual cure that was posited by neurologist Silas Ware Mitchell. And this cure included 6 to 8 weeks of forced bed rest and isolation that was often prescribed for hysteria. Charlotte Perkins Gilman not only wrote The Yellow Wallpaper about a fictional woman undergoing this type of treatment, she herself also underwent the rest cure. And you can read about, of course, I have a copy here of The Yellow Wallpaper. And then in the diaries of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, she talks about her actual experience with this rest cure. So for many centuries, according to Mark McCall, a PhD, a former assistant professor of the history of Yale, he says for centuries, hysteria served as a dramatic medical metaphor for everything that men found mysterious or unmanageable in the opposite sex. So a woman was not obeying her husband, a woman was expressing her thoughts or speaking her mind, then she was deemed hysterical and could be institutionalized. So I want to also talk about another article, and this one, let me make sure I give the proper credit here. This one is written by Kate Moore for Time.com. She talks about an actual case of Elizabeth Packard in June of 1860, who was institutionalized for so-called madness. She was a housewife and a mother of 6, and her crime was simply standing up to her domineering husband. She recorded in defense of her sanity that she wrote while she was institutionalized that I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his. But of course, in those days, assertive women were swiftly dispatched to asylums, institutionalized for causing great annoyances to their family and for defying all domestic control. This was written, like I said, by the actual woman experiencing this in the 1860s, Elizabeth Packard, while she was at the Jacksonville Insane Asylum in Illinois. So the medical wisdom for this age was that assertive, ambitious women were unnatural and therefore sick. For centuries, women's natures have been thought inextricably linked to their reproductive organs. So that's where we get that whole hysteria. Then in the 19th century, of course, that Victorian era, biological based gender roles came to the fore: work and intellect for men, home and children for women. It was one small step for doctors to declare that any woman who rejected her submissive domestic role was medically impaired. One doctor actually is quoted as saying in 1858, after he visited a girls' school, "You seem to be training your girls for the lunatic asylum." What were these girls doing in this school? Simply studying and reading. So any woman who studied or read or who had a mind of her own and was determined to use those minds was demonstrating, quote, eccentricity of conduct, which meant they were, quote, morally insane, which was a diagnosis invented by James Cowles Pritchard in 1835. And it was very easy, as we will see in Crypt of the Moon Spider, that it was very easy for a husband to have his wife committed. When Elizabeth, for example, they're talking about here, Elizabeth Packard, when she was put into the asylum, her husband found that he could arrange his wife's committal simply by requesting it, and specifically without any evidence of insanity required in other cases. So, for this reason, a woman had little to no recourse if her husband decided to institutionalize her. So, I'm going to check our comments now, and then we will talk about the book itself. So, the spoiler or the content warnings will continue pretty much throughout the book, but not as heavy as what we just talked about there, being that it was actual history. So another 4-star. And hey, Liz, how are you? I'm glad you could join us. Hello, Martina. She didn't get to read, but listening in. All is well enough. We'll leave it at that. I hope all is well with you too. Stina said her grandmother was dissatisfied as a life solution. Yes, exactly. ECT, if you don't know, that's electroconvulsive therapy. So this is very real, very relevant. Although, of course, when we talk about Crypt of the Moon Spider, we definitely have those science fiction elements, but it's also, Nathan Ballingrud is also discussing a very real topic and a very real thing that not just women, because other, genders experienced it too, but we'll kind of see, as one of the patients in Crypt of the Moon Spider is a man. I want to kind of talk about what he did to be institutionalized versus what our main character, Veronica, who is a woman, what she did to be institutionalized. So we'll go ahead and put spoilers up because we are going to be getting into some spoilers now. So the first thing I do want to talk about is our characters. So first of all, let me get my little notes again, because if I don't have my notes, we might be out there floundering somewhere. So let's talk about Veronica first. I'd like to know what your thoughts of Veronica were. Of course, our story focuses on Veronica as she is being institutionalized by her husband for her, her periods of darkness, or her, I forgot exactly what she calls them, her black periods. I should I'll find that in my notes in a minute. But anyway, just her periods of darkness. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I liked Veronica. I could identify with her in some ways, for sure. I'd like to know what you all thought about Veronica, if you had any particular thoughts that you wanted to share about Veronica. Then we have her husband. I don't like her husband whatsoever at all. Not only did he commit her, but he is very dismissive of her, which did remind me once again of the husband in the yellow wallpaper. Very dismissive, very much treating Veronica like a child. Then we have, of course, Charlie Duchamp, who Veronica terms as Grub. He's an orderly, but we find out in the story he's got his own backstory. We find out a little bit more about why he's there and why he might behave in the way that he does. And then we have Dr. Cole, who is our doctor performing these procedures. And I also do not care for Dr. Cole. Then we have Bentley, who is the other patient that I mentioned that Veronica meets, and they have a conversation about why they're in there, what they're experiencing, and what might be going on at this institution. And then, of course, we have the moon spider itself and the alabaster scholars, who are those who worshiped the moon spider, and they are still down there in the crypt over which this institution has been built. So I'm going to check our comments now. Yes, exactly. I definitely felt sorry for the way that Veronica was made to feel her, about herself. One of the quotes that really stood out to me in that respect is when Veronica it says she had come to believe that weakness was inherent to her nature. And I felt like that was a lot of, the feeling put upon her by her husband and by society in general, because she did struggle with mental illness and she was made to feel weak because of that. And if you follow my channel, you know that I am diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So there were a lot of aspects in which I felt very, very much akin to Veronica. Yeah, Stina said also she could identify with Veronica. And yeah, her husband, he was awful. So I want to go ahead now and talk about her husband. So I'm going to switch our banner over to themes and symbolism, even though we are, of course, within that banner going to still be talking about characters. But one of the things I really want to talk about is the theme of mental illness and the patriarchy. So a few of the quotes that I pulled that really, to me, exemplify this, and also hone in on what Stina mentioned about her husband being awful. So her husband hated it when Veronica would start talking about something without reference, as though they were already in the middle of a conversation. He was a surgeon by profession, a man of science, he often said. She knew it was a bad habit, but she supposed it didn't matter much anymore. The bad habits would be taken away very soon. He gave her one of his thin smiles, a compression of the lips which suggested cultivated patience, as though he were indulging a child's whims. And this is because Veronica just says something about Galileo. So she's kind of having this, dialogue in her mind, and she just says part of it out loud to her husband. And he makes her feel absolutely ridiculous for doing so. I do that too. Sometimes I will be with my husband, for example, and I will say something about something I was thinking about. And he's like, what is it? And then I tell him, but he has not acted the way this husband did. He doesn't give me like this little smile or look at me like he's annoyed. So I think that is something common with people who are neurodivergent in different kind of ways, that we have this ongoing, thoughts, and we have these, thoughts in our head. And sometimes we just blurt stuff out, not really thinking about that other people around us don't know what we're thinking about. But it was just the idea that he was indulging her childish whims. And that reminded me a lot of what the narrator in the yellow wallpaper says about her husband, because she is, prescribed this rest cure for her mental illness. And she says of her husband, John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. So she expects in the yellow wallpaper that her husband is going to dismiss her, that he is going to laugh at her. Also in the yellow wallpaper, she says, John is practical in the extreme. He is a physician. So again, that connection to Veronica's husband, that physician. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in writing her narrator in the yellow wallpaper, even takes that line of thought further about the narrator's husband being a physician, because she says, perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. That's because these husbands / physicians, they think they know what's best for their wives. So they are not really listening to their wives. Therefore, their wives cannot get better because they aren't being adequately treated for what the condition or the problem really is. They're being silenced and dismissed by their husbands, by the medical professional, and so they don't get better. And these treatments that are prescribed often make them even worse. John describes in the yellow wallpaper that, he says his wife has a slight hysterical tendency. And he even goes so far as to say, bless her little heart. She shall be as sick as she pleases. Which I thought about too, as back in our, story that we're talking about here, Crypt and the Moon Spider, Veronica's husband, when he leaves her at the institution, is like, I love you, pet. Very much, he treats her like that's all she is. So I'm going to check the comments now. Eleanor doesn't like spiders. Wondering if the story. I think the spider is a good guy. What do you think? The spider's like, no, we're not going to be doing this to these patients anymore. I like the spider. I'm interested to see what everybody else thinks. Okay, so Stina says, yeah, just respond with context, right? Because it's okay. Obviously, if someone says something you're not sure what they mean, and you're like, no, what is it? I like that idea, context, because you're not making the person feel bad for having a thought that they speak aloud, but you're wanting to know, okay, so, kind of clue me into what's happening here. And yeah, Stuart also bounces around in conversation. And you'll probably notice I do that a bit on my live shows. I'll, sometimes I have what I want to say in my brain. It's just sometimes getting it out to, in words, exactly what I'm trying to say. But I feel like I'm in good company here. Liz said, likes how the novel shows oppression faced by Veronica was more structural than the result of one bad husband. Yes, he was the worst, but like you said, Liz, he was able to institutionalize her because of the larger society and patriarchal oppression of women, that if a woman, was not pleasing her husband in whatever way that meant to the husband, all he had to do was say, hey, my wife needs to be committed, and it was not going to be a problem for him to get that done. It's definitely reflective of that larger societal issue. I agree. All right, so let me go back now. We'll go back to some more themes and symbolism. Another thing that I want to talk about in terms of mental illness too, because a lot of what we just talked about was kind of in connection to the yellow wallpaper. there's a little bit more to this. Is probably a stretch, but you know, I I sometimes stretch things. I probably read too much into stuff. This may be a little bit on the nose, but Veronica describes Bentley, the fellow patient that figures into the story, as a pleasant face that seemed somehow false, like a coat of yellow paint on a haunted house. So I just kind of, honed in on that idea of yellow. And it did make me think of the yellow wallpaper and this idea that yellow, sometimes in literature, it means sunny and bright. So it would appear to be, something positive, something pretty, something light, but it can also mean thick or sallow, right? Yellow. And the yellow wallpaper, it's the wallpaper itself that serves as symbolic of the narrator's descent, further into her illness because of her isolation, because she's stuck in this room with this yellow wallpaper that has strange patterns on it in which she begins to see things. But you may think, initially, because the house is kind of old and a little bit dilapidated and the yellow wallpaper is peeling, but initially maybe it was beautiful, yellow, bright, cheerful, but then it's hiding something sinister underneath. Just like this patient being treated, depending on how they're getting treated, the true patient may still be under there, the struggles, the pain, but it's covered over with this facade, because very much like a lobotomy, that's really what takes place when this spider silk in this story is put into the patient's head. So again, you've got this false sense of, everything being fine and bright. No, we're all just going to get better here, but it's hiding something very sinister. And then Charlie Duchamp, who is the orderly that Veronica calls Grub, he says to her, "Go play, little girl. No books, they might upset you." So again, that made me think about the rest cure that is talked about in the yellow wallpaper, and was the actual cure by an actual, Dr. Mitchell, that you would not only be prescribed bed rest and isolation, but you would not be allowed to read or write because it might upset you, right? As a woman, you might get these fanciful ideas. We can't have you reading or writing, using your imagination. All of that's like a big no. So again, I just thought about just the way that she was so dismissed by her husband, by this orderly, by the doctor, as we'll see a little bit more when we talk in a minute. So I would love to know any quotes that you might have read that really stood out to you as indicative of the way that the mentally ill were treated. And I should say are treated, because we still face stigma today, and we may have come past some of these issues, but certainly not all of them. And we certainly have more, that much more that needs to be changed and advanced today. But the next theme, like I said, if you want to keep popping in the comments, anything that you particularly noted about mental illness, don't think just because I am going on to something else now that if you think of something, you can't put it in there, because you can. So I wanted to talk about nature too, because nature is also an important theme in Crypt of the Moon Spider. You also, within nature, definitely have elements of the Gothic and this idea of isolation. It's very haunting in the way that nature is described. There's symbolism, there's foreshadowing. So one of the things that I noticed initially about the surroundings of the Barrowfield institution was this quote: "The forest was covered in a vast system of spider webs, cast over the canopy of every tree, so that it seemed they were flying over a ghostly wood. A revenant returned from darkness in a terrible glamour." So we already have the indication of spiders, right? The spider webs cast over the canopies of the trees. And then I wanted to talk about this word revenant. A revenant returned from darkness. So a revenant is a person who is returned, especially a person who has come back from the dead. So I thought that was an interesting choice of words. And then further in the sentence, a revenant returned from darkness in a terrible glamour. So in folklore, a glamour is the magic that fairies have that makes them seem beautiful and alluring, but the glamour actually hides the sinister nature of the fae folk. If you know Celtic folklore, you know fairies aren't these nice little Tinkerbell type creatures. So again, that made me think back too to this idea of the coat of yellow paint on the patient that was covering a haunted house. This idea of this glamour, something beautiful on the surface, but it's hiding something sinister or dark underneath. So I thought that was a really great way to use nature to kind of foreshadow or get us into the mindset of what this novella was going to be about. So I'm going to pop in and check comments real quick before we go. Yes, the visuals were very spooky, and I felt so much like I was right there. I thought he did a great job of evoking that gothic nature and that element of what we could see. Hey, Elaine, I'm so glad you popped in. Sounds like a creepy book and spiders. No, freak me out. Yeah, but it's not spiders in the way you would think. Not like the movie Arachnophobia kind of spiders. Or it's a very different. So you might want to take a peek at it, Elaine. You might be able to do it. So another aspect I noticed was how many times that Nathan Ballingrud talked about trees. There was another quote: the trees wall them in, gathering darkness beneath them like heavy skirts. So something else I noticed he did a lot was personification, right? Assigning human-like qualities to something that is not human. In this case, like the trees. So the trees, it makes the isolation that much more intense, and that sinister feeling that they are surrounded, that there's not a way to escape. And then he also, Nathan Ballingrud, the patient that Veronica encounters, Bentley, he says they're doing bad things to us. The trees stood like cold sentinels, crowded and bleak, curtained with webs. So he does this description of the trees right after Bentley says they're doing bad things to us. So again, that just made me think about the isolation and also this idea of webs. It's like, yes, of course, there are, there's the moon spider, so there's going to be webs. But I also thought about this idea of web as being a metaphor or a symbolism for the patients being trapped there, like flies in a spider web. So I just really, thought about that too, the literal spider and the web, but also this idea of being trapped somewhere. So I'm going to check the comments now again. Yes, I like that idea too. Stina talked about the subversion of nature. Yeah, the result of humans meddling in nature, right? Going places where we shouldn't necessarily be, and encroaching upon nature and putting our, self into somewhere that we maybe shouldn't. Thank you, Elaine. I appreciate it. I appreciate you catching that rewatch. I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, so I do want to say if you are watching this on replay, thank you so much. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. So another example too, with the trees, they watch the dark web-draped trees rustle in a sleepy wind. So many references to the trees. And I would love to know anything else that you thought about the trees too, or any aspect of nature. I'm going to get a sip of my sparkling ice, and then we'll talk a little bit more about mental illness. One of the things that stood out to me again that goes back to what we talked about at the beginning with how easy it was for a husband to have his wife committed to an institution. In Crypt of the Moon Spotter, Ballingrud writes, with the scrawl of his signature, the custody of Veronica Brinkley was transferred from himself to the Bearfield home for the treatment of the melancholy, where she was to be treated until sane, however long it might take. So again, this custody, right? The custody of Veronica Brinkley was transferred from her husband to the institution. So she had no agency, no autonomy. She was in the custody of her husband, and then she was in the custody of the institution. So there was no talk of her as an individual, as an entity that could exercise agency. She's belonging to her husband and then belonging to the institution. And then again, because of all of this, like we talked about already when we talked about Veronica, this idea of her feeling that weakness was something that was just inherent to her nature. Black spells, that's what she had, black spells. For some reason, I couldn't get the word spell. But I also could really identify with her when she talked about feeling the like coming on of one of her black spells, like some strange sun threatening the horizon. I don't know if it's the case for everybody with major depressive disorder. I know my experience, but I don't want to say that's everyone's. I can feel when I have a depressive episode coming on, similar to Veronica's talking about a black spell. I think of mine as like this dark cloud that I feel right here, and it's like looming and threatening, and I know that it is going to envelop me. And I do have medication, and I do have regular psychiatry and therapy appointments, so I deal with it, but it's still there. It's still, at times I feel it coming on. And I was thinking every time Veronica talked about having a black spell come on, that I could understand what she meant. Definitely. So I'm going to check the comments too. Yes, I did too. Stina talked about the alternative vision of what the moon might be like. I appreciated that too, because I didn't really kind of know going into it exactly what we were getting into, but I liked it too. Yeah, the forest. Yeah. And I do I live in a very rural area, so I have a lot of woods, around me. And I don't find them threatening, but I did find this wood, this particular set of woods threatening, I think, because of the sinister nature of this institution. And then, as we talked about before, the way that Nathan Ballingrud described nature, the trees walling them in, the webs over all the trees. So I felt a little unnerved by by this particular description of the forest. Yes, however long it might take. Yes. And that's another thing too that I didn't talk about at the beginning when we were going through historical context, but there were certain treatments that were given to, I'm sure all genders of patients, but the particular article I read was about what happened to women. There was a particular drug that could be prescribed to especially boisterous women that would subdue them for a little while. And the sentence went further on to say, or for eternity. So that definitely happened, for sure. This idea of treating someone, and if they died by treatment, oh well, right? Yes, Winston Churchill described depression as a black dog. Yes, exactly. So I think a lot of people, again, I won't say everyone, but a lot of people experience it as like something dark, right? Because it is dark. It feels dark. So yes. sometimes I forget to, there we go, put the banners back up. So I appreciate y'all's patience. This is only my second live book club show, so I'm still getting there. And another thing where we, kind of honing in on that loss of autonomy and agency is when Grub or Charlie, the orderly, is having this conversation with Veronica, and he just, doesn't call her by name. And she reminds him, right? She says, "My name is Mrs. Brinkley. You knew it this morning." And he says to her, "I thought you might want to forget that." And Veronica's like, "Forget what? My name?" And he says, "Yeah, you might. It's easier that way." So that really drove the point further that she has no identity, that it is better for her, according to the institution, if she just forgets her name and forgets who she is. That also has historical context because patients were often referred to just by numbers and not by their names, because they were seen as not worthy to be in society. So what's the point of having names? And that just really, something that's small in the book has such larger meaning. And I really, at that point, I had to stop for a few minutes and just take a little break and think about that. That just reinforces the sadness of how those who were mentally ill were treated. And I should say, are still at times. It's not just something historical. Then I wanted to also talk about Bentley, and the reason he was sent to Berryville. So this is the man that is a fellow patient, and he tells Veronica that he tried to not only take his own life, but the life of his wife and children. His reasoning was that he didn't want them to be without a father and a husband. So if he was going to take his own life, he wanted to also take theirs. And that's what got him in the institution. But Veronica was put into the institution for having these black spells. And then later on, we found out from Dr. Cole that according to Veronica's husband, she has become withdrawn, uncommunicative, morose without cause, hints at suicide, and has failed to attend to the responsibilities of a wife. So that got Veronica institutionalized, but what it took for the man to be institutionalized was actually trying to take someone else's life. And to me, there was just that contrast between what the two of them did and what brought them to the institution. And I just, especially that aspect of being, not attending to the responsibilities of a wife. So, scoot off then to the institution because you're not behaving as a wife should. And there was just that discrepancy between reasons why someone was institutionalized. And then Dr. Cole actually says to Veronica that her husband sent her there to stay, that he thinks that she's going to die while she's there. He doesn't even think she's going to get better. So that goes back to that idea too of just institutionalizing someone, what Stina said about however long it might take, right? That it's just going to be permanent. And now her husband doesn't even care about her anymore. And let's see, I want to talk about this. Yes. So Stina said one of her grandmother's so-called sins was not wearing lipstick. Exactly. If a woman was not performing, however, society thought she should perform as a woman, if she wasn't performing femininity properly, then she would be institutionalized. It's baffling to me, and it's very scary. I'll just say that. It's very scary, even now, maybe even especially now. It's very scary. And then I also thought about the whole gaslighting too, because one of the things that the doctor says to Veronica is has it occurred to you that your aversion to treatment is a symptom of your illness? So, in other words, if you as the patient are not on board with some of your treatment, then, oh, that's because that's just part of your illness, which I get it. You know, sometimes I don't want treatment that is, I know, beneficial for me. I just don't feel like it and I don't want to do it. But there is a difference in that versus the kind of treatment that we're talking about in Crypt of the Moon Spider. So naturally, a patient would have an aversion to having spider silk put into their brain, right? Or, you know, in real life terms, some of the other actual treatments that happen, like a lobotomy. So if you were averse to treatment, they would just gaslight you and say, that's just because you're mentally ill. Now come on over here and let us do this procedure. And then I also wanted to talk about that relationship between the moon and madness. Of course, we know, lunar and all of that has connotations with madness. But another aspect that I did want to talk about too, and talk about this a little bit more later, is the idea of the moon as feminine. You know, in literature, the moon is often equated with the feminine. So that's something else that I wanted to kind of think about when it comes to empowerment and what eventually takes place in this story with Veronica. Just this idea of the moon. Yes, it can mean madness, but it can also mean femininity and women in power. So kind of moving on with the same, keeping that idea about the moon in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the spider and the alabaster scholars. So I'm just going to read a passage because I have some questions and I'm hoping maybe you can help me figure it out. It was with terror and disbelief that Veronica contemplated fetching an axe from the barn and swinging it into the sleeping skulls of her family. Now, did she do this when she was younger or not? Did she just think about it? I was kind of confused about that part where she kept going back to this idea of like putting an axe in her family. I'd love to know your thoughts. If she actually did this in her past, if this was something she had just thought about doing, is it something that was put into her head at the institution? Help. So if you have help, I'll wait for you to put that in the comments because I did not quite understand exactly what was going on there. And then I wanted to talk about when she actually does encounter these spiders. Veronica stepped closer, feeling something like holy wonder. Despite the spider's death, she felt the presence of a coiled power radiating from the roots of the trees, from the spider's corpse, from the web curtain darkness itself. It crawled over her skin with a million tiny legs. So then it says, a voice carried to her, soft and sibilant, followed quickly by more. Veronica crept forward, driven by an appalled curiosity. The adult in her had been subdued by violence and fear, and the little girl she used to be, the one who sang to the moon, who stared at its radiant eye each night and vowed to understand its mysteries, was in the ascendant. So I really liked that idea that this little girl in her is reemerging. This fear and this oppression she's been under as an adult is being quieted, and she's going back to feeling powerful. Again, that connection to the moon and the moon as empowerment and being indicative of the feminine or the woman. So now I want to see if anybody has any help for me. Yeah, see, that's something I was wondering too. Like Stuart said, that I agree. It wasn't always clear what were Veronica's memories versus what were Grubb's memories. And Grubb may have done that because we do find out enough about his backstory in Crypt of the Moon Spider that that we know he is a person who might have some tendencies toward violence. And Eleanor said it might have been the tea. Yeah. And Stina said something we'll find out later in the trilogy. I think so. I think so. I hope so, right? And Adrienne thought her memories getting mixed up with Grub too, as far as the axe murders. Yeah, that makes sense because I was like, what is happening here? And I tried to read over it a few times and I was still like, my brain was like, I couldn't quite figure it out. So thank you. Thank you. I guess we'll be patient and wait for further details, right, in the second and third book. And then Dr. Cole, he talks about how the spiders or the denizens of the spider, they're not going to eat her because Soma betrayed him and put something into Veronica's brain. So Soma is one of the Alabaster scholars who has been there supposedly to help the doctor. And the rest of the scholars are supposed to be like the enemies, but apparently Soma was never really, intent on actually helping the doctor. He was sort of a plant there to bring about the reemergence of the moon spider. But it also talked about, and this too has a lot of Gothic connotation to it, that the Alabaster scholars didn't like that the doctor had built his hospital over their crypt. They didn't like it that he went down into their tunnels, and they liked it even less that he was using the spider silk in his surgeries. Even though Dr. Cole said the spider had been dead for years and that all the moon spiders had been dead for years, maybe not quite so as dead as he thought. And then again, this idea of the moon, this quote, what if the moon is the remnant of some ancient being, all its exotic memories archived in the webs tended to by the spiders? The Alabaster scholars are trying to hatch a new moon spider. Their grotesque failures infest the tunnels beneath us. But why do they want this? Is it because the spiders might awaken what sleeps, or if it's dead, call to another? So I liked that idea too of the spiders calling to or reaching out to another to continue their existence, but also to stop what this doctor is doing in this institution. Then I think we can move on to, well, I do want to talk a little bit more about the moon and Veronica's past, how she was questioning her mother about why her brothers didn't have to do something that she had to do, even though they were already finished with their work. And her mother told her basically, we as women are always going to have to do those kind of things. Men don't have to do these things. We as women have to do these things. And our identity is kind of rooted in, doing things for other people, especially, husbands or children. So she had that idea in her mind, but then she also talked about, telling her father one day she was going to the moon. So even as a child, she had this connection to the moon. So I wondered if that is why the spiders kind of chose her, if she had sort of been chosen all along, or if they just, somehow discovered, either the Alabaster scholars or the moon spider, that this new patient had a deep connection. So I started thinking about, was it something that was always in place? I guess we'll find out more about that as we go to. Then I want to go ahead now and go to our sort of final thoughts and kind of like the ending. Whenever Grub actually snaps Dr. Cole's arm and things start to take a bit of a shift, then I was like, okay, so what is happening outside? Because Veronica says, or she thinks, she, or doesn't think, I guess you could say, did not spare another thought for her husband, who was by now suffering ways unfathomable even to a practitioner of the surgeon's art. Instead, she felt a swelling of joy on behalf of all the imprisoned melancholy, all of whom would live, all of whom would become host to great populations. Soon these cold and ghostly forests would throng with life once again, and the moon would open its glaring eye. So, or what is going after her husband and these other people? Is that something we're going to find out later? I really like the idea of the empowerment there too, not just for Veronica, but for all of the patients who had been mistreated in this institution, this idea of reclaiming of their lives. We'll check these comments now. Yes, yes. Adrian says, always like a spider as a symbol of the feminine and deadly. Yes, like Black Widows, right? And again, that ties also into this idea of the moon as being feminine and overshadowing, right? The patriarchy. I think it's so, like, there's so much to think about. This is such a short novella, but it leaves us with so much to think about. And the second book I'll talk about in just a minute. We don't have to wait that long for it. Hey, Adrian. Oh, wait, I skipped Travis. Well, hey to you too, Adrian. Hey, Travis. Just saw you were live. Pop in and say, hey, I love you too, Travis. I hope you have a great day. I hope you're having a wonderful, fun weekend. Okay, Adrian said Frankenstein was an inspiration for him and would factor more in the second book. The Fall of the House of Poe and I, words, Poe and I approve. This is very exciting. I clearly love Edgar Allan Poe, and Frankenstein is my favorite classic. So that makes me even more excited for book 2. All right. So let's see. Yes, it definitely does make a lot of sense for sure. This idea of Frankenstein and the Fall of the House of Usher, I love it so much. All right. So if you keep having final thoughts, then please feel free to share those. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about some read alikes and some watch alikes. So obviously, right, the yellow wallpaper, which I've talked about a little bit today. Another read alike I thought about, especially in connection to the moon and women being mistreated by society, was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Again, with the moon idea and this idea of a woman reclaiming her power, I could not help but think about Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King, because you have the eclipse that figures into both books, that connection to the moon. You have these women that get visions of one another, and these women that are able to overcome patriarchal oppression to come into their own sources of power. So I couldn't help but think about those two books. Other books I thought about, also movies. I think every book I'm talking about has a movie adaptation. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, as far as treatment of the mentally ill. That book is by Ken Kesey. I have not read the book. I have the book, but I haven't read it. But I have watched the movie a few times. Also thought about Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. I have the book. I've read the book, but I haven't watched the movie adaptation of it yet. But again, treatment of the mentally ill, and for Girl Interrupted, obviously, especially for women and how they're treated. Then for watch alikes, besides the film adaptations of those books, I pretty much just thought about watch alikes in terms of lunar gothic. So ideas of something in the past coming back to haunt the present, but set it on the moon. Alien, obviously, Event Horizon, and then Life. I would love to know any more read alikes or watch alikes that you thought of. And then if you would indulge me for a moment, a couple of listen alikes. So there are a couple of songs by Taylor Swift that I thought would fit well with Crypt of the Moon Spotter. Those songs are both on the Tortured Poets Department album. One is Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, and the other one is I Hate It Here. So just any Swifties or not Swifties out there, just check out Who's Afraid of Little Old Me and I Hate It Here. So I'm going to go back and check our comments. Let's see. Yeah, Adrian knows me. Yeah. I definitely like Frankenstein, Poe, put them together, and that is how you summon me. It is, I agree, making the moon habitable and setting the sanatorium there in 1923. Yeah, because you think about the way that he chose to set it in that year, 1923, because a lot of the aspects that we talked about at the beginning with historical context are still prevalent during the 1920s. So it was very interesting that he took the past, but then he set it, in sort of a future idea where you could live on the moon and have an actual mental institution there. I don't know what exactly made him think of that, but I guess that's why he's the writer, and I'm just here talking about it because it is brilliant. Yeah, I've heard that that the book is harder to read than the movie is to watch. So like maybe that's why it's been sitting on my shelf for so long. I might get to it one day, maybe. Definitely. Current Stewart is currently reading Hungerstone by Kat Dunn. It does touch on some very similar themes of patriarchal oppression and the way that women were treated by their spouses. And plus, Hungerstone is amazing. It's like a Carmilla reimagining. So if you haven't read Hungerstone yet, Stewart and I are here to tell you you need to pick that up. Oh, yay, Liz. You have me thinking about Yellow. Yellow shows up in Crime and Punishment. I haven't read that yet. And Dorian Gray, but in relation to men tied to their actual moral failings. I love that. Dorian Gray is one of my favorite classics, but I've never thought about Yellow in that aspect. I might have to go back and read Dorian Gray. Thank you, Liz. Yes, unlike here and in the yellow wallpaper, it's perceived moral failings of women solely defined by men. Yes, important distinction. Yes, because these women are definitely categorized by men as being morally failing for not performing these wifely duties. Oh, Nicole, thank you for stopping by. And I am looking forward to seeing what you think about Crypt of the Moon Spider. All right. So I do want to talk a little bit about the upcoming book, the book 2 in Nathan Ballingrud's Lunar Gothic trilogy is titled Cathedral of the Drowned. It is set for release October 21st of this year, so not too long from now. And it focuses on Charlie Duchamp, or Grub, as Veronica called him, who is, of course, the orderly at Barrowfield, who plays a very important role in the major events of Crypt of the Moon Spotter. Like we said, has some memories that are resurfacing, and we get a lot more about him at the end. So I'm looking forward to seeing his backstory and seeing how that's going to figure into not only book 2, but then book 3 in the trilogy as well. Kind of reminds me of the ENT who diagnosed my badly deviated septum, acted like it was a character flaw. Yes. And that is an aspect too of medical treatment that still happens for a lot of people, people who identify as women. The way that we can be dismissed, or everything is, said to be in our minds, is all in your head. So sometimes we don't get the treatment that we really should and the respect that we deserve. All right, let's see. Right, I agree. The medical profession, yeah, has a lot to apologize for. The further you dig into it, the worse it gets. The worse it definitely gets. And again, I have fear and concern in present day around these topics that we covered today. So they're relevant. They're definitely relevant and not something, unfortunately, that's just in the past. I think that's everything that I wanted to talk about. If you are catching the replay, thank you again for watching. I want to thank everybody who came today. I appreciate you reading. I appreciate you giving your input. I appreciate you helping me understand where I had some questions in the book. And I look forward to seeing you all again. We are not going to be doing a Literary Love Book Club in October, which usually I do just every other month anyway. But we will be doing one for November. That is going to be Blood on Her Tongue by Johanna Van Veen. October, I want you to enjoy your spooky season and read a lot of good books, whether they're spooky or not. And I'm going to check the comments again and say thank you so much again for spending part of your Saturday with me. I appreciate you taking that time. Ooh, more recommendations. Eleanor said, Kill Bill, when Uma Thurman finds herself strapped in the hospital bed, fighting her way out. Maybe Valerie will also get some revenge. I haven't seen Kill Bill. I know. Believe it or not, I haven't seen it. Thank you, Liz. I appreciate your input and your concept about the color yellow in Crime and Punishment and the picture of Dorian Gray. Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Stina. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your experiences and the experiences of your grandmother. Those are very important to recognize and talk about. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate you. Thank you all so much. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And if you're watching the replay, I hope you have a wonderful rest of whatever it is you might be doing. Bye, everybody. Thank you all. Bye.